March 5, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first American hunter-killer group prepared to set sail for the Atlantic. Captain Giles Short, commander of the USS Bogue, reviewed the encrypted message from the 10th Fleet. Ultra-intelligence had decoded German naval transmissions, revealing the position of multiple refueling rendezvous points for submarines. The Milk Cow submarines, U-459 and U-487, were scheduled to resupply the wolf packs operating along the convoy routes. The operations officer picked up the secure telephone. An escort carrier supported by 4 escort destroyers would hunt the hunters: USS Bogue, USS Belknap, USS George E. Badger, USS Osmond Ingram, and USS Clemson. What none of them knew was that this single deployment would trigger the most catastrophic reversal in the history of submarine warfare. In 8 months, American hunter-killer groups would destroy the myth of submarine invincibility and force Admiral Karl Dönitz to withdraw his entire submarine fleet from the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic taught both sides that submarine warfare was not just about sinking ships. It was about tonnage calculations. Sink more tonnage than the enemy can build, and victory will follow. Lose submarines faster than they can be replaced, and defeat is inevitable. The submarine arm of the German Kriegsmarine had established dominance over Atlantic shipping routes. In March 1943, wolf packs sank over 80 ships, totaling nearly 500,000 tons. In April, losses would increase to over 600,000 tons, the peak of the submarine offensive. The arithmetic seemed to favor Germany. 20 new submarines entered service each month, while average losses were fewer than 10. Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded over 400 submarines from his headquarters in France. His Wolfpack tactics had nearly severed the lifeline between America and Britain. Convoys SC-121 and HX-229 had been massacred. Winston Churchill would later write that the danger of submarines was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The USS Bogue displaced 9,800 tons and carried a crew of 890 men. Her flight deck stretched 495 feet, launching 12 F-4F Wildcat fighters and 9 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. But the carrier's greatest weapons were technologies the Germans did not yet understand. Centimetric wavelength radar, invisible to German detection equipment, high-frequency direction-finding equipment that could triangulate submarine radio transmissions with devastating accuracy, and, carried in the bomb bays of her Avengers, a secret weapon designated the Mark 24 mine to disguise its true nature: the Fido acoustic torpedo. The hunter-killer concept represented a fundamental shift in anti-submarine warfare. Traditional convoy escorts could only react to attacks, forced to choose between pursuing submarines and protecting merchant ships. Hunter-killer groups had no such constraints. Their sole mission was to find and destroy submarines wherever they operated. Lieutenant Commander Howard Avery would later command Composite Squadron 9 aboard the Bogue. A veteran of Atlantic convoy operations, Avery understood that submarines were most vulnerable during 3 critical periods: rising to the surface to charge batteries, meeting supply submarines for fuel and torpedoes, and transmitting radio reports to Dönitz's headquarters. German submarine doctrine required frequent radio communications, position reports every 24 hours, contact reports immediately after sighting, convoys, weather observations twice daily, and damage assessments after attacks. Each transmission was a potential death sentence, revealing the submarine's location to Allied direction-finding stations. Aboard the U-569, Kapitän Lieutenant Hans Johansson reviewed his patrol orders. 7 weeks at sea had exhausted fuel reserves to critical levels. Radio instructions directed him to meet the Milk Cow U-459 at coordinates 50 degrees 40 minutes north, 35 degrees 21 minutes west. Johansen had commanded the submarine since the beginning of 1943, replacing Hans-Peter Hinrichs, who had led the boat in her previous patrols. The U-569 was a Type 7C submarine, the workhorse of the German fleet, displacing 769 tons on the surface and 871 tons submerged. It carried 14 torpedoes and a crew of 44 men. Its 4 bow tubes and single stern tube had been responsible for one merchant ship and damaged another during its career, a modest tally that reflected the increasingly dangerous environment of the Atlantic. But the submarine's greatest vulnerability remained unchanged since the Great War. Diesel engines required air for combustion. Electric batteries needed hours of charging on the surface. A Type 7C could remain submerged for 18 hours at economic speed, but high-speed evasion exhausted the batteries in less than an hour. American hunter-killer groups exploited these weaknesses with scientific precision. Search patterns calculated to maximize radar coverage, air patrol schedules timed to catch submarines on the surface, and attack protocols designed to maintain continuous pressure until the batteries were exhausted. At 2:20 p.m. on May 22, 1943, Avenger pilot Lieutenant William Chamberlain detected a submarine on the surface via radar. Range of 18 miles, bearing 90 degrees relative. He pushed the joystick forward and began his attack run. The U-569 was sailing on the surface at 15 knots, with its diesel engines charging exhausted batteries after a night of evasion. The bridge watch spotted the aircraft approaching at 8 miles. Alarm bells rang throughout the boat as Johansen ordered an emergency dive. Crash dive procedures for a Type 7C required 35 seconds from the alarm to periscope depth. Ballast tank valves opened, diesel engines stopped, and electric motors were engaged. The submarine's bow tilted sharply downward as tons of seawater flooded the tanks. Lieutenant Chamberlain's depth charge pattern hit the U-569 at a shallow depth. 4 Mark 17 charges configured for shallow detonation. The explosions severely damaged the submarine, forcing it back to the surface. A second Avenger, piloted by Howard Roberts, was already in position when the submarine reappeared. Roberts attacked immediately, but ceased fire when he observed white flags appearing on the submarine's periscope. The crew was surrendering. The Canadian destroyer HMCS Saint Laurent was sent to the scene, but as it approached, Johansen ordered his crew to scuttle the boat and abandon ship. 25 of the YE 40-40-44 crew members survived to be pulled from the Atlantic. 19 men sank with their boat. The capture of survivors from the U-569 provided Allied intelligence with valuable information. During the interrogation, the German submariners expressed shock at the precision of the American air attacks. "They knew exactly where we were," one survivor stated. "It was as if they could see through the ocean itself." But ultra-intelligence had revealed more than individual submarine positions. Cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had decoded the entire German naval grid system, identifying patrol areas, wolf-pack assembly points, and supply rendezvous coordinates. Every submarine at sea was potentially compromised. On June 5, 1943, aircraft from the USS Bogue located the U-217 charging batteries on the surface 450 miles west of the Azores. Captain Lieutenant Kurt Reichenbach-Klinke had commanded the submarine in 3 patrols, sinking 3 ships totaling 10,651 tons. Bogue's aircraft attacked at dawn, catching the U-217 in vulnerable moments before the dive. The depth charges from the first Avenger damaged the submarine's diving mechanism. Unable to submerge, Reichenbach-Klinke ordered his gun crews to attack the aircraft while damage control teams worked desperately to repair the diving planes. The surface combat lasted 18 minutes. The U-217's 88mm deck gun and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons fired more than 300 rounds. A Wildcat suffered light damage from shell fragments, but the submarine was fighting a losing battle against aircraft specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. An Avenger from the Bogue squadron delivered the fatal blow with depth charges that surrounded the submarine perfectly. The explosions destroyed the U-217's pressure hull in multiple locations. The submarine sank with all 50 crew members, including Reichenbach Klinke. No survivors were rescued from the oil slick that marked its grave. The psychological impact on submarine crews was immediate and devastating. Radio intercepts revealed growing anxiety among submarine commanders about American wonder weapons that seemed to find targets regardless of evasion tactics. Morale reports spoke of crews becoming increasingly reluctant to emerge, even for essential battery charging. Admiral Duenitz responded to the growing losses with tactical modifications. Submarines were ordered to cross the Bay of Biscay submerged, regardless of battery exhaustion. Surface refueling was restricted to 220 darkness. Radio transmissions were reduced to the absolute minimum, but these measures only delayed the inevitable. The Americans had the momentum and the technological advantages that tactical changes could not overcome. In June 1943, 5 hunter-killer groups were operating in the Atlantic, each centered on an escort carrier with screens of escort destroyers. USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Core, USS Santee, and USS Croatan represented an industrial capacity that Germany could never match. The USS Card, commanded by Captain Arnold Buster Isbell, would become one of the most successful hunter-killer groups of the war. Between July and October 1943, Card's group would be responsible for 8 confirmed submarine sinkings, earning the first Presidential Unit Citation awarded to a hunter-killer group. The techniques developed by Card's team became standard doctrine. Aircraft would patrol in expanding box patterns from the carrier's position. Surface radar contacts triggered immediate attacks. Submarines making emergency dives were marked with die markers and pursued by escort destroyers using Hedgehog mortars and depth charges. On August 7, 1943, Card's aircraft located the Milk Cow U-117 refueling the U-66 on the surface. The supply submarine was surprised with the fuel hoses still connected, making an emergency dive impossible. Lieutenant Charles Stapler's Avenger attacked immediately, dropping 4 depth charges that hit the U-117. The explosion of more than 400 tons of diesel fuel created a column of fire visible from 30 miles away. The U-66 managed to dive but was damaged by the explosion. It would survive this encounter only to find its fate 9 months later in one of the war's most unusual battles. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Barkston, commander of the U-521, witnessed the destruction of the U-117 from periscope depth. His war diary captured the shock felt by submarine commanders. The Americans appear everywhere simultaneously. Their aircraft arrive without warning. Their weapons are impossibly accurate. We are no longer the hunters, but the hunted. October 1943 marked a turning point that would define the remainder of the Atlantic War. The submarine arm lost 23 submarines that month, including several veteran commanders who had survived since 1939. Each loss represented an irreplaceable experience that training schools could not replicate. The destruction of the Milk Cow submarines proved to be particularly catastrophic. U-488, U-489, and U-490 were all sunk within weeks of each other. Without refueling capacity, Type 7C boats could no longer reach the American coast. Patrol areas contracted to the central Atlantic, where hunter-killer groups waited in increasing numbers. The USS Core hunter-killer group refined the doctrine of continuous air coverage, keeping aircraft over suspected submarine zones for days at a time, exhausting submarine batteries through relentless pursuit. This technique proved to be devastatingly effective, even against experienced commanders. On October 13, 1943, the Core Group surprised the U-378 on the surface at dawn. The submarine's commander, Oberleutnant Zur See Erich, had just celebrated his 26th birthday. His inexperience was evident in his response to the attack, attempting to fight on the surface instead of diving immediately. 4 Wildcats strafed the U-378, while 2 Avengers positioned themselves for depth charge runs. The submarine's anti-aircraft gunners managed to damage 1 Wildcat before being swept from the conning tower by machine gun fire. The command to abandon ship was given as depth charges shattered the pressure hull. Only 1 survivor was pulled from the water. The brutality of these encounters shocked even experienced submarine veterans. Korvettenkapitän Hinrich Bleichroth, one of Germany's greatest aces with 24 ships sunk, barely survived an attack by aircraft from the USS Block Island in October 1943. His submarine U-109 returned to port with extensive damage. Bleichroth never sailed again, telling fellow officers, "The Atlantic has become a slaughterhouse." November 1943 brought new American innovations that further tilted the scales. The introduction of MAD, magnetic anomaly detector, allowed aircraft to detect submerged submarines at shallow depths. Sonobuoys dropped in patterns could track submarine movements for hours. The technological gap was becoming insurmountable. Kapitänleutnant Ralph Reimar Wolfram commanded the U-405 in 7 successful war patrols. His experience and tactical skill had kept his crew alive in encounters that had destroyed smaller boats. He had developed techniques to evade aircraft, using cloud cover and rain showers to mask his submarine's position. On October 31, 1943, the U-405 was operating with the Siegfried Wolfpack when the USS Card Hunter-Killer Group arrived in the patrol area. The destroyer USS Bogue obtained radar contact at 9:00 p.m., range of 6,500 yards. What followed would become legendary in naval history. The U-405 dove, but was forced back to the surface by depth charges. Unable to dive again due to damage, Wolfram decided to fight on the surface with deck guns. In the darkness and rough seas, the 2 vessels collided, with the Bogue's bow rising over the U-405's forward deck. For several minutes, the ships were locked together. The crews fired machine guns, pistols, and threw hand grenades at point-blank range. American sailors threw coffee mugs, shell casings, and, in one case, a sheath knife at the German gunners. The surreal combat continued until the vessels separated. Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins, captain of the Bogue, ordered all weapons to point at the submarine. More than 4,000 rounds of ammunition were spent, while the U-405 tried to escape. The submarine's conning tower was riddled with holes, its deck gun destroyed, and its hull punctured below the waterline. Wolfram ordered to abandon ship as the U-405 sank by the stern. Only 8 of the 49 crew members survived the freezing Atlantic. Wolfram was not among them. The Bogue itself was mortally damaged in the encounter and would be scuttled the next day. The engagement demonstrated that even the most experienced submarine commanders could no longer survive against determined hunter-killer attacks. The technological revolution that enabled the success of hunter-killers extended beyond radar and guided torpedoes. Operational research scientists had developed optimal search patterns using probability theory. Acoustic analysis could distinguish propeller signatures of individual submarines. Statistical models predicted submarine behavior based on thousands of observations. High-frequency direction finding proved to be particularly devastating. German submarine doctrine required regular radio reports to coordinate wolf-pack attacks. Each transmission lasted only seconds, but that was enough for Allied stations to triangulate positions within a 2-mile radius. Submarine commanders faced an impossible choice: maintain radio silence and lose tactical coordination, or transmit and reveal their position. The Germans believed their Enigma encryption system remained secure. They did not know that codebooks captured from the U-559 in October 1942 had allowed British cryptanalysts to break the 4-rotor M4 cipher. Every operational order from Dönitz to his submarines was being read by Allied intelligence within hours of transmission. December 1943 saw the destruction of several veteran submarines that had survived since the early days of the war. The U-172, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Karl Emmermann, had sunk 26 ships totaling 151,000 tons. Its crew was considered elite, having developed innovative tactics to penetrate escort screens. On December 13th, the USS Bogue hunter-killer group intercepted the U-172 in the Central Atlantic. The submarine had just transmitted a weather report, with its position betrayed by direction-finding stations in Bermuda and the Azores. The first attack came from Lieutenant Junior Grade William Fowler, launching a FIDO-guided torpedo that the U-172's acoustic operator detected in time to evade. But evasion required high-speed maneuvers that exhausted the batteries quickly. In 2 hours, 3 more aircraft had arrived to maintain contact. For the next 14 hours, the U-172 played a desperate game of survival, emerging briefly to ventilate the boat and then diving when radar detected aircraft approaching. At 8:00 a.m. on December 14th, with each exhausted batteries and depleted compressed air reserves, Hoffman had no choice but to emerge and remain on the surface. The U-172's anti-aircraft weapons attacked the surrounding aircraft, while damage control teams attempted futile repairs. The surface battle lasted 43 minutes. The escort destroyers USS George E. Badger, USS Clemson, USS DuPont, and USS Osmond Ingram converged on the submarine's position, firing more than 400 rounds from their main batteries. The U-172's hull was punctured in 17 locations before it finally sank. 46 of its 57 crew members were lost. 13 survivors were pulled from the water. During the interrogation, they revealed the depth of despair among submarine crews. The ocean has become a trap. We cannot hide. We cannot run. We cannot fight effectively. Every patrol is expected to be our last. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. The submarine force that had almost made Britain surrender by hunger was now being systematically destroyed. January recorded 19 submarines lost. February, 20 the more. March, 23. The arithmetic of destruction was relentless and accelerating. Young, inexperienced commanders were being sent to sea with minimal training. Oberleutnant zur See Wolfgang Hera, commander of the U-434, was 23 years old and had less than 6 months of experience in submarines when Card's aircraft caught his boat on the surface in March 1944. He ordered his crew to fight instead of diving, a fatal decision that resulted in the loss of all men. The quality gap between American and German forces increased with each combat. American pilots accumulated hundreds of hours of experience in anti-submarine patrols. Radar operators learned to distinguish submarine signatures amidst surface interference at maximum range. Acoustic operators could identify individual submarines by their distinct propeller sounds, tracking specific boats across thousands of miles of ocean. German submarine crews, conversely, were becoming younger and less capable. The average age of submarine commanders fell from 32 to 26. Veteran petty officers, who formed the backbone of submarine operations, were increasingly rare. Boats sailed with crews who had never experienced combat, led by officers who had graduated from abbreviated training programs. Admiral Dönitz's son, Peter, exemplified this tragic trend. The young Dönitz served aboard the U-954 as a watch officer. On May 19, 1943, the submarine was surprised on the surface by British escorts and sunk with all crew members. The loss of his son did not prevent the admiral from sending other young men to similar fates, but it underscored the personal cost of the failed submarine campaign. Spring 1944 brought new American innovations that made submarine operations virtually suicidal. The introduction of centimetric radar in all hunter-killer aircraft eliminated the last sanctuary of darkness. Lee lights turned night into day, illuminating submarines on the surface miles away. Even the most experienced commanders could no longer avoid detection. On May 6, 1944, the USS Buckley demonstrated the intensity of hunter-killer operations in one of the most bizarre encounters of the war. The destroyer Escort located the U-66 on the surface west of the Cape Verde Islands. Oberleutnant Gerhard Seehausen had commanded the submarine through 9 patrols, sinking 33 ships. His experience counted for nothing against the forces mobilized against him. Unable to dive due to battery depletion, the U-66 attempted to ram the Buckley. The two vessels collided at 15 knots, with their hulls grinding against each other in the darkness. German and American sailors exchanged small arms fire at point-blank range. The surreal combat included sailors throwing coffee mugs, ammunition casings, and hand grenades between the ships. Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel's crew fired 105 3-inch projectiles, 2,700 rounds of 20mm ammunition, and 418 rounds of 40mm shells in 16 minutes. The hull of the U-66 was perforated in dozens of locations. The submarine sank with 24 of its 48 crew members. Hand-to-hand combat represented the final agony of an era in which submarines could operate as surface privateers. The capture of the U-505 on June 4, 1944, by Captain Daniel Gallery's hunter-killer group from the USS Guadalcanal, represented the ultimate demonstration of American dominance. The boarding party from the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury descended through the U-505's conning tower while the submarine was still in motion, with seawater flooding in through damaged valves. They closed the sea valves, stopped the flooding, and saved the submarine from sinking. The intelligence value was enormous. Code books, cipher machines, acoustic torpedoes, and technical manuals fell into American hands. But the symbolic value was even greater. Submarines were no longer fearsome predators, but prizes to be taken. Their crews, prisoners instead of warriors. The invasion of France in June 1944 brought hunter-killer groups into the Bay of Biscay, hunting submarines that were attempting to attack the invasion fleet. The confined waters became a killing field. 15 submarines were destroyed in the first week of June alone. Survivors described attacks by dozens of aircraft simultaneously, making escape impossible. Lieutenant Commander Herbert Werner, one of the few submarine commanders to survive the war, described the experience of facing hunter-killer groups. We would detect aircraft on our radar, make an emergency dive, and within minutes, we would hear the impact of sonobuoys above us. Then the escorts would arrive, maintaining contact for days. We would surface, gasping for air, only to find aircraft already waiting. It was a systematic extermination. In August 1944, Dönitz ordered the evacuation of French bases as Allied armies approached. Submarines attempting to reach Norwegian ports faced continuous attacks from hunter-killer groups positioned along their route. Out of 31 boats that attempted the passage, 11 were destroyed. The survivors arrived with extensive damage and exhausted crews. The introduction of the snorkel breathing tube allowed submarines to operate diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. But this innovation came too late and proved inadequate. Boats equipped with snorkels were still vulnerable to radar detection and could make only 6 knots while using the device. It represented a defensive adaptation, not a return to offensive capability. September 1944 saw the deployment of the most advanced hunter-killer technologies to date. The Mark 24 Fido torpedo had been improved with greater range and sensitivity. New Hedgehog mortars could saturate an area with contact-detonated projectiles. Radar could detect objects the size of a periscope at 5 miles. The technological mismatch had become absolute. Lieutenant Commander Gunther Hessler, commanding the U-107, witnessed the destruction of 3 other submarines in his wolf pack. During a single night in October 1944, his war diary recorded, "The enemy possesses capabilities that we cannot counter. They strike without warning, with perfect accuracy. We are no longer fighting men, but machines that never tire, never miss, never show mercy." The final months of 1944 saw submarine losses reach unsustainable levels. November, 24 boats lost. December, 27 boats lost. New construction could not keep pace with the rate of destruction. Training facilities were bombed. Fuel, supplies dwindled. The submarine force was dying, and everyone knew it. Nevertheless, Dönitz continued to send boats to sea, driven by Hitler's demands and his own refusal to accept defeat. Young men who should have been in school were given command of submarines after hasty training. Entire crews set sail on their first and last patrol simultaneously. The hunter-killer groups had transformed the Atlantic from a battlefield into an execution site. The story of the U-396 exemplified this final phase. Its commander, Oberleutnant zur See Ernst Günther Unterhorst, and his entire crew had an average age of 20. They departed from Norway in November 1944 and were detected by the USS Core Hunter-Killer Group within 3 days. The pursuit lasted 18 hours. When the U-396 finally surfaced, with its batteries dead and air exhausted, it was immediately destroyed by the waiting aircraft. There were no survivors. The winter of 1944-45 brought the snorkel-equipped Type 21 submarines into service. These boats could sustain 16 knots submerged and possessed advanced sensors, but only 2 became operational before the end of the war. The hunter-killer groups won the race against German technical innovation through the raw weight of numbers and the systematic destruction of the existing submarine force. The statistics told the complete story. In 1942, submarines sank 1,160 Allied ships, totaling 6.2 million tons. In 1944, they sank 132 ships, totaling 773,000 tons. The hunter-killer groups reduced the effectiveness of German submarines by 90%. At the peak of production, American shipyards launched over 140 Liberty ships per month, nearly 3 every 2 days, each carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. The arithmetic of the tonnage war had become impossible for Germany. By March 1945, the submarine force existed largely only on paper. Out of 463 boats nominally available, fewer than 60 were operational. Most remained in port due to lack of fuel, torpedoes, or trained crews. Those that sailed faced certain destruction from the hunter-killer groups that had perfected their craft through 2 years of continuous operations. The final humiliation came in April 1945, when the U-546 attacked the USS Frederick C. Davis, part of the USS Bogue's protective screen. The destroyer escort sank, but within hours the U-546 was hunted down and destroyed by the remaining escorts. It was the last submarine destroyed by the Bogue's hunter-killer group, bringing its total to 13 submarines destroyed. 2. Last entry in Admiral Dönitz's war diary regarding submarine operations contained a bitter admission. The enemy's superiority at sea, particularly in the field of science and technology, has torn from our hands the most effective weapon we possessed. The submarine war has ended in defeat. The transformation had taken less than 2 years. In March 1943, submarines had nearly severed the Atlantic lifeline, sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. By March 1945, the submarine force was effectively extinct, its remnants cowering in ports or being methodically destroyed at sea. The hunter-killer groups achieved this reversal through the systematic application of superior technology, intelligence, and industrial capacity. They transformed submarine hunting from an art that required intuition and luck into a science that demanded precision and persistence. Every aspect of anti-submarine warfare had been optimized through operational research and practical refinement. The USS Bogue ended the war as the most successful hunter-killer group, with 13 confirmed victories. The USS Card claimed 11. The USS Core destroyed 6. These escort carriers and their protective screens sank more submarines than traditional fleet units could have imagined possible. But their greatest achievement was not in the numbers, but in the methodology. They demonstrated that modern warfare would belong to nations capable of integrating intelligence, technology, and industrial production into unified combat systems. Individual skill and courage, while still important, could not overcome systematic disadvantage. The Romantic era of submarine warfare, where a skilled commander could overcome material odds through cunning and determination, had ended forever. The shock felt by German submarine captains was not merely tactical, but existential. They entered the war as elite warriors, the Grey Wolves, who would strangle Britain's maritime lifeline. They ended it as hunted animals, trapped between an ocean in which they could no longer hide and a homeland they could barely reach. Commander Peter Kremer, one of the few submarine aces to survive the war, would later write, "We had no answer for the hunter-killer groups. They possessed every advantage. Radar we couldn't detect, weapons we couldn't escape, intelligence that revealed our every move, and, most importantly, the ability to be everywhere at once. We went from predators to prey in what seemed like overnight. The human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Of the 40,000 German submariners who went to war, 30,000 never returned, a casualty rate of 75%. 784 of the 1,162 commissioned submarines were destroyed. The loss rate for boats on their first patrol exceeded 50% by the end of the war. Entire graduating classes from the submarine school were annihilated within months of completing their training. American losses, by contrast, were minimal. Hunter-killer groups lost only one escort carrier in the E.E. Ford. Atlantic, the USS Block Island, torpedoed in May 1944, and fewer than 10 destroyer escorts throughout the entire campaign. The casualty ratio that once favored submarines 10-1 was reversed to favor the Americans 20-1. The tactical innovations developed by hunter-killer groups influenced naval warfare for decades. The integration of air and surface assets, the use of intelligence to direct operations, and the application of operational research to optimize tactics all became standard doctrine in modern navies. Cold War anti-submarine warfare relied heavily on lessons learned in the Atlantic, but perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The submarine force had represented German naval power and technological prowess. Its destruction by American hunter-killer groups demonstrated that industrial capacity and scientific advancement would determine future conflicts. The era of individual heroism had yielded to the era of systematic warfare. In May 1945, With the IB surrender of Germany, the remaining submarines received Dönitz's final order: surface, fly black flags, and proceed to Allied ports. Of the 49 boats that complied, many were commanded by officers under the age of 25. Their crews were composed of teenagers who had never seen combat. They surrendered to hunter-killer groups that were preparing to destroy them with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the entire campaign. The last operational submarine patrol ended on May 7, 1945, when the U-320 was sunk by British escorts. Its commander, Oberleutnant zur See Helmut Emmerich, was 24 years old. He and his entire crew of 36 men represented the final casualties of a force that had once threatened to change the outcome of the war. Post-war analysis revealed the elegant efficiency of hunter-killer operations. Search patterns were optimized using probability theory. Weapon delivery was calculated to maximize the probability of destruction, while minimizing ammunition expenditure. Communication intercepts were correlated with operational patterns to predict submarine behavior. Every element had been refined through rigorous analysis and practical application. The greatest shock for German submarine captains was not the loss of tactical superiority, but the speed and completeness with which it occurred. In March 1943, wolf packs had nearly severed Atlantic supply lines. By November 1943, submarines were being hunted to extinction, their bases under constant surveillance, their communications compromised, and every movement predicted and countered. This reversal occurred not through any single technological breakthrough, but through the systematic integration of multiple advantages: radar that could detect submarines day or night, aircraft that could patrol for hours hundreds of miles from base, weapons that could find targets regardless of evasion attempts, intelligence that revealed enemy intentions before they were executed, and industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The hunter-killer groups wrote the first chapter of modern naval warfare, where victory was determined not by individual courage or skill, but by systematic superiority across multiple domains. They transformed the Atlantic from a vast hiding place into a transparent battlefield where every movement was observed, every transmission intercepted, and every mistake punished with destruction. Admiral Dönitz would spend 10 years in Spandau, prison as a war criminal, contemplating the destruction of the force he had built and led. His post-war memoirs contained a telling passage. "I had believed that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantage. The American hunter-killer groups taught me that in modern war, technology and industrial capacity are decisive. We were not defeated by better sailors, but by better systems." The legacy of the hunter-killer groups extends beyond their wartime achievements. They demonstrated that future naval warfare would be determined by the integration of air and surface forces, the fusion of intelligence with operations, and the application of scientific methodology to tactical problems. The nuclear submarines of the Cold War, equipped with sophisticated sensors and weapons, were direct descendants of the concepts proven by escort carriers and destroyer escorts in the Atlantic. In the cold depths of the Atlantic Ocean, over 500 German submarines rest on the ocean floor, their steel hulls slowly dissolving into the abyss. They are monuments to the devastating effectiveness of American hunter-killer groups, who transformed submarine hunting from a desperate defensive measure into an offensive campaign of systematic destruction. The young men who commanded these doomed vessels had entered service believing they were joining an elite force that would determine the war's outcome. They discovered instead that they were facing an enemy who had transformed warfare itself, replacing the art of combat with the science of destruction. Their shock at this transformation echoed through the ranks of the submarine force and ultimately through naval history itself. The German submarine force had entered 1943 as masters of the Atlantic, with their wolf packs savaging convoys with near-total impunidad. They ended it as hunted fugitives, their bases bombed, their supply lines severed, their experienced crews dead, and their remaining boats cowering in ports, or fleeing from relentless pursuit. The shock of this reversal would resonate through naval history as the moment when technology, intelligence, and industrial capacity forever changed the nature of warfare at sea. The American hunter-killer groups of 1943 to 45 shocked German submarine captains not through superior seamanship or courage, qualities both sides possessed in abundance, but through the systematic application of an overwhelming technological and industrial superiority that transformed the ocean from a sanctuary into a killing field where precision, not valor, determined survival. The final statistics were irrefutable. The hunter-killer groups and their allied counterparts had sunk 784 German submarines. They had killed 30,000 German submariners while losing fewer than 5,000 of their own men. They had reduced the submarine threat from near victory to complete defeat in less than 2 years. It was not merely a military victory, but a demonstration that the nature of warfare itself had fundamentally changed. The era of the lone wolf submarine operating independently through stealth and cunning had ended. The future belonged to integrated naval forces employing sophisticated sensors, weapons, and intelligence in coordinated operations. The hunter-killer groups had not just won the Battle of the Atlantic. They had revolutionized naval warfare and shocked their enemies with the completeness of their transformation from hunted to hunter.